Well, welcome to Marhelm. I'm here with Matt Warder, who I have seen described online as the king of coal, also known as the OG coal godfather. Matt is an energy, metals, and mining analyst with nearly 2 decades of experience covering the natural resource and industrial sectors. As founder and CEO of the management consultancy and financial analytics firm Seawolf Research, Matt provides investment and consulting services to clients across multiple sectors with a focus on energy, metals, mining, and industrial supply chains. Matt previously founded Energy Capital Research Group and spent a decade at Wood Mackenzie as the principal analyst for coal, iron ore, and steel. Well, Matt, thanks for joining.
It's my pleasure, Charles. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Perfect. I saw you referred to as the king of coal and the OG coal godfather online when I was doing a little reading ahead of our conversation. So it'd be great to give the listeners a little bit of background on yourself and how the legend of Matt Warder came to be.
Well, Matt Warder started off in the music industry, so he wasn't much of a coal legend ever. But I grew up in West Virginia. Actually went to college to play baseball, of all things, at William and Mary, and then stuck around and got a degree there in chemistry. That was the idea. I was going to go to medical school, and then I got hurt. I hurt my elbow playing baseball, and I had all this extra time on my hands, and I picked up a music degree, and then snuck into as I was applying to med school. I started a band called The Argument, and right as I was getting ready to go, we started actually doing pretty well and touring. So I had deferred medical school and taught in the school system locally, music and science and language and stuff, and we'd tour on the weekends. We did that for about 9 years. But because we were all teachers, we had we taught privately, so we had these students of who would range from 7 to, I think my oldest one at one point in time was 75. And when we decided to pull back from touring, I had one of my students who was we were studying jazz mostly, but I was concerned about, well, I have to go find a job or whatever. And he was a coal geologist at a company called Hill and Associates, and he suggested that, well, why don't you come work with me? And I thought he meant come help me, be an administrative assistant, basically. And no, he actually needed somebody to come on and do data analytics and other things. And so I got to learn all that from the ground up with him, working from home in Morgantown, West Virginia. And about, maybe 4 or 5 months after I came on board, we were bought by Wood Mackenzie, who's this big global, consultancy. Yeah. They're really well known in the oil and gas space. In fact, that's almost what they did exclusively when they came in and bought our firm. And they bought our firm because you can't really forecast, gas or power prices without forecasting thermal coal. And so they went out and bought our firm here, and then they bought one called Barlow Yonker in Sydney, combined them all to make this like one global team. And so in the span of 6 months, I went from being, a musician to being a coal market analyst for this huge company. And that was great.
That's your fast.
Yeah, right. It was baptism by fire. But the great part about it was I was incubated in this great organization with a whole lot of smart people across disciplines, and they were great about bringing folks over to help us learn about oil and gas, and we had access to all this great research. And so for me, it was just so much to absorb. I mostly just kind of kept my head down and kind of ran what we did and learned as much as I could on the side. But it's like once you start to get up to a level, and especially with coal, when if you're doing thermal coal, that intersects with natural gas and power prices. But if you're working on the metallurgical coal side, that intersects with steel markets, which intersects with auto manufacturing and consumer driven sorts of things. But it also impacts shipping. Logistics is a huge part of what goes in to make up a steel cost, but it also, steel is part of the input for shipbuilding. It's part of the input for, tube and pipe is a, cost input for drilling for oil and gas. So, once I got up to kind of that level, you almost by default have to become, at least have a pretty good understanding of macroeconomics to understand how those cycles turn. And then, from there, I went to go to a firm that wanted us to do equity analysis. So I hadn't done anything like that. And, in the process over there of building up all of our, all of my supply demand price forecasting models and trying to do this iterative, modeling process on oil and gas and coal and power, and iron and steel all at once. Our parent company, the company who was funding us, was approached by Sprott and Rick Rule to write a resources-based newsletter. And they volunteered me to do that because, because I was the only one who had any kind of expertise in mining. And then I got to learn about, base metals and precious metals and uranium and all the stuff with Sprott. And I had access to their analysts and got to ask, not only like their people questions, but all of a sudden I had access to the executive suite. And that was a different experience altogether because mostly, on the corporate consulting side, you're working with, the younger iBanker teams to kind of bring them up to speed or whatever. Now all of a sudden I'm plugged into the C-suite. And that's when you start to get pretty good at those kinds of things. But anyway, long story short, that company lost funding in 2000. I sort of went out on my own, and now I do this combination of like supply demand price forecasting on a bespoke basis for clients. I'll do expert witness testimony in coal. The one central theme through all of that is I've always done coal in some way, shape, or form, whether that's as a part of steel or as a part of doing power analysis or as a part of just global macroeconomic, movements of materials. It's always been like the one thread that is stuck throughout my career. And because fewer and fewer people have specialized in it, because why would you? Because the coal industry is going to die or whatever. We haven't really attracted a new generation of analysts that cover the sector. And, I'm just kind of a unicorn in that sense, having all that experience and having done it for this long. And then also having, this other kind of interesting background as well, in adjacent, mining industries and commodities and that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
I'm jack of all trades, master of one. But it's right now at this point in time in the world as it's developing, it's a good thing to have a mastery of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So
that's right.
Perhaps there's some segues to the coal industry there, but
there are for sure.
Obviously, coal's been kind of out of favor, if you will, with the investment community and whatnot. How have you kind of seen the sentiment shift from call it the mid 2000s through 2020 and into present, kind of where we sit today?
Well, it was prior in days of yore, when I started in the industry, it was still covered in most metals and mining groups at at major iBanks and those sorts of things, and it still is, but they don't focus on the equities at all. They're not necessarily always as interested in individual companies or in nuances about whether a company can bring on production quickly enough or pull back. Like that sort of interest is waned because nobody's going to finance any new projects. The risk on financing a project is that there's going to be no demand for it in 5 years or however long it takes to bring on. So
right.
Yeah, there's just very little appetite for any kind of anything in coal that isn't going to cash flow tomorrow. And back then that wasn't the case. That's the biggest, I think, shift over that time. And at its core is this problematic narrative that, well, we're not going to need thermal coal anymore. We're not going to need coking coal to make steel. We're going to reduce use hydrogen to do all of the reduction that we need. We're going to recycle and use EAFs to build everything that we need. We don't need high calorific value coal because we're going to have solar and wind and all these things. And the problem with that is the world still grows. China's growth has come to a pause and is, we're going to flatten out. Instead of growing at 6-7%, we're going to grow at like 2 or 3. It's going to start to look like the United States, but India's growing. The sub-Saharan Africa is going to grow over time. So, and the one thing that kind of sits at the core of all that is you cannot recycle your way to growth. Like, you just can't do it. I don't make the rules of physics,
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, and that's even before we get into like the material availability. Do we have enough, lithium or copper or nickel to build to transition the vehicle fleet? Do we have, Do we need to do vanadium redox flow for the power industry so we can get grid scale batteries there and incorporate intermittent power producers like solar and wind better into the mix? Like there's all these unanswered questions, and the only thing that really is consistent amongst them is, well, we know what the goal is, and the question is how fast can we get there? And the difficulty is if we go too fast, we're going to break things. And if we go too slow, then we do have a warming problem. We've seen that in North Atlantic temperatures here this year, which interestingly sort of like dovetail back into shipping. The lack of turns out using higher sulfur bunker fuel had some temporary benefits. There's like no ship tracks in the Atlantic Ocean, and the temperature went up by like 2 degrees in summer, something ridiculous.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You've also seen articles about how potentially dumping the sulfur from the scrubbers into the ocean has impacted that. But yeah, hard to know how all that is impacting things.
It's hard. It's very difficult. Like all of these things sort of put together are very difficult for sort of anyone to understand. And to pull it back to coal, it's like the takeaway is that you're going to need more of it for longer than you think you do, and we're not financing any new production. And so what that means is you get what you get, and you don't get upset when the price goes to, infinity, essentially, during any kind of period where you are forced to rely on it unexpectedly. Like that's the takeaway.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, some of the listeners I know are just maybe missed the initial boom in coal coming out of 2020. But maybe just a kind of a coal 101 here, thinking about thermal coal versus met coal, what are just some of the big bucket items that people should keep in mind as they're kind of picking through this sector?
Okay. Yeah. Coal is it, people lump it into this one category and think it has to do with, power generation, but coal isn't one thing. It's a lot of things. It's more like a gradient. So, on the higher quality side, you have higher calorific value thermal coals. The hotter the coal, generally, the more power you can generate with it, right? And then you have lower rank coals that have much less heat or are more difficult to burn. They have more byproducts that get pollutants that get put into the air. So on the thermal coal side for power generation, the cleaner the products you can burn, the less problems you're going to have from an emission standpoint, right? And on the metallurgical side, for steel making, metallurgical coals have properties that thermal coals don't have. Most thermal coals, when you burn them, they turn into dust. But there are some coals that when you burn them, at high temperatures, and in particular without oxygen, they turn into like lava, basically. And what they do at a coke oven is they take these coals that don't disintegrate, basically, and they heat them up to the point where they get fluid, and they'll mix together to form like a charcoal, basically, is what it is when you cool it down. It's like size of a baseball kind of chunks, and that's just pure carbon. That's coke, is what that's called. And so in a blast furnace, there are two types of steel production. There's blast furnace production, which uses the carbon from coke as both the fuel and the reductant for iron ore, which is FeO2. The coke picks off one of the oxygens in the iron molecule to become FeO, and that molten metal trickles down through the coke down to the bottom of the blast furnace, where it's collected and then siphoned off, and then taken to reduce it further into just molten Fe, cast out into slabs and that sort of stuff. But the coke has to do two things. It has to serve as the reductant and get hot enough to melt the metal, but it also has to retain its strength, so that the layer of iron ore that you put over top of it's like a layer of charcoal, layer of iron ore, layer of charcoal, layer of iron ore, and then you fire it with natural gas from below. That coke has to be able to hold its shape so that the metal can trickle down to the bottom. If it doesn't, then you can have explosive properties. God forbid it get wet. Molten metal and water don't mix, for sure. So it's just a different property altogether of certain types of coals. You don't have them everywhere in the world. We have them in Appalachia in good quantities. We have them in Canada. We have them in Australia. They have some in China that are pretty good quality. A lot that aren't. Russia is a large producer of metallurgical coals. A little bit produced in, that the Donbass, Kuzbass area, in Ukraine. It's the center of conflict right now. That's helped to kind of constrain supply. I mean, it's just there's a little bit in Poland. There's just not much of it, and if there's not much of it, then there just by the transitive property, there aren't many projects to go and build that are of certain qualities, right?
Yeah.
So thermal coal goes from low heat to high heat. Metallurgical coal, the spectrum there is volatile content, stuff that gets driven off into the atmosphere when you heat it up. So we have low volatile coals, which have a percentage of around somewhere between 7% and call it 22%. We have mid volatile coals, which are like 22 to 28% volatile matter, and then high volatile coals, which are 28 to whatever, 36, 37. And then within the high volatile coals in the US, there are very good quality coals, which are high vol A, and not so great quality coals, which are high vol B. In Australia, there's more. In Australia, we have semi-soft, which is sort of like weaker coking coals. They don't have, they're not quite as strong if you went in the coke oven after you heat them up. China has a completely different classification based on different geological tests. It's just met coal gets weird and complicated because the end users have different specs of everything to use. And different qualities are important to different people. So it's hard. It's an esoteric market. It sort of gets weird, but broadly for the investors, there's thermal and there's met. And then we can break out into the individual qualities when they become, pertinent to the equity analysis itself.
Gotcha. So it's more similar to the oil industry than maybe I gave it credit
for.
Oh,
it's directly analogous, right? I mean,
you have different grades of oil. You've got different refineries that run on different grades of crude. Very fascinating.
The mantra in the quality matters is basically the bottom line. For oil, like the U.S. doesn't have enough heavy crude, so we need to import heavy crude from Saudi or from Venezuela or from somebody who has just Canada preferably, who has the right sort of for you guys it's viscosity, right? So how well does it flow from one area to another? How much sulfur is in it? Like those are the important sort of metrics for oil, but for thermal coal, it's heat content, and for met coal, it's volatile content. And those are the two kind of broad buckets that we use, but they're directly analogous, absolutely directly analogous.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of the pricing curves for all these different things, but first, you mentioned obviously the huge geopolitical event with the Donbass region and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I remember reading about some of the kind of geopolitical issues with China and Australia around some of their coal exports. Mm-hmm. What are the things that you're tracking in that space? What should investors kind of keep an eye out for as it impacts the coal industry?
That's a big question. We probably need to break that up into parts. Drill down a little bit. So do you want me to talk about the evolution of pricing, like since Russia, or should we talk about seasonality? Because there's seasonality in each type. We should probably separate thermal and met into two separate discussions because they have different end markets. In Russia affected them differently.
Okay, interesting.
So it's a loaded question, and it's sort of arbitrary how we proceed. But
okay, so obviously it makes sense depending on who the producers are of certain things. Different geopolitical events would impact that, but it's kind of high level. What sort of things we can get to pricing a little bit later, but just as you're looking at kind of the global market, what are some of the things that you're tracking there?
Well, the biggest impact from Russia was trade flows, and when trade flows get disrupted, it also disrupts price, and that's why in early 22, all of coal just went to the moon because when you pull that much out of the market, I mean, Russia supplied 40 million tons of thermal coal to Europe and another 10 million tons of PCI coal, which goes into steel. PCI is pulverized coal injection. So they basically crush it up into a powder and inject it, and that reduces how much coke they need. So it's kind of a cost-saving measure. It's usually a lower price coal, but nowhere else produces it. Australia produces a little, but it's being used, by Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, and India. The U.S. produces a little bit. We don't inject as much as Europe does, and ours is higher volatile content. So it's a different burning coal completely. Like, we're just not a big participant in PCI markets. So like, you have this coal that you can't replace in Europe, which is crazy. So they had to use more coke, and that means they had to import more met coal. And this came at a time when nobody was expecting it. So the cost curve, I mean, basically like could only supply so much. And when you move out past the end of that, whoever that marginal supplier is, that's supposed to be the end price. But if you go beyond that, the price of the next ton is whatever somebody's willing to pay. So it's essentially infinity. And that's the weird thing about coal markets right now, is because both thermal and met, we're precipitously like right on the edge of the amount of coal that the cost curve can supply. And any disruption whatsoever on the demand side, on the supply side, has the ability, or could push prices right back up to $500, $600, wherever they were. I think on the thermal coal side, that's really driven by gas, which I can show here in a second. But on the met coal side, the bus is no longer really being driven by China. It's being driven by India. I can show you how in a second.
Okay.
But so there's
China,
very different.
China's such a big factor in the shipping industry. Obviously, they're a huge importer of crude oil. Anywhere from 40-50% of AG VLCC cargoes go to China, and then in terms of steel for the dry bulk industry, it's a huge end user there. So how obviously China's very important for the coal market, but how important are they, would you say?
Well, they're not quite as important for the U.S., Canada, Australia, for the major suppliers anymore. They built out a rail system in Mongolia, which allows them to import a lot more from Mongolia. And since the Russia-Ukraine conflict, China has been one of the recipients, because they're not sanctioned. They can take as much Russian coal as they want. Sort of like the Saudis are taking Russian product. Well, China's taking Russian coal at a discount relative to the rest of the world. But again, Russia can only supply so much. So under normal times, when China is well supplied, they're not really participating in seaborne markets much at all, for metallurgical coal. When they do come into the market, and especially if India happens to be actively buying, that's when you start to see here recently prices really creep up. On the thermal coal side, they can get most of what they need from Indonesia. They'd had a ban on Australian coal until recently, high calorific coal. So, they would find a little bit wherever they could, buy a little from South Africa, buy a little from, the U.S., buy a little from Canada, but not in huge quantities. But now when they need it, there's, again, when they come into the market, it makes a difference. So China is less important for like the day-to-day price machinations for coal as it was 10 years ago. But it's still incredibly important, because when they need it, it's not there. Supply chains basically, played musical chairs post Russia, Ukraine. Russian coal is now going to India and China, and that's basically it. Few places in between, but India and China are the big consumers. Should that change, geopolitically, then we could have the reverse problem. We could have too much coal going into Europe, or too much coal going into Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. Like that could disrupt things. My track record of predicting geopolitics is unblemished by success, so we won't speculate on that. But that's like the biggest risk to coking coal markets, is like a 6 to 9 month disruption where we undo what we did, and then things have to re-equilibrate, right?
Right.
It's all going to equilibrate back to the same point eventually, but one process produces one outcome, the other, a positive outcome for price, the other produces a temporarily negative one.
Gotcha. Well, we had some interest in, as people are, kind of on the entry level on coal, what coal indexes are you tracking kind of on the coal pricing side? Maybe you could run us through quickly just, how to track some of the pricing here. And then I'd love to kind of pick your brain on a couple of stocks.
Sure. I'll pull up, let me share a screen here. All right. Let me know when you guys can see that.
Yep. Awesome.
All right. So this is the coking coal curve right now. And I've got the history going back from 2018, so we could see some historical levels, because they've really kind of played out. I mean, almost like a decent technical analysis. So here is this was the run up in 2021, and then a decline, and you can see Russia, Ukraine here, and that takes about, what is this, March to July, right? So 4 months to begin to resolve, but then, even in the months after that, when supply came back into the market, we were back up at 375, and then took another, what is this? Yep, 4 months. So the market for met kind of moves in these 4 to 6 month cycles. China is really active buying here in the early parts of the year. This spike was driven by China was in the market, restocking like they normally do, and then all of a sudden Europe got hit with, well, we're not going to be able to buy Russian coal anymore. So Europe piled on. This last movement from basically around the $225 level up to we're basically a little bit over 300 at the moment, was India came into the market to buy in Q3, right as July budgets opened up, which is pretty typical because they buy cargoes that are going to arrive post monsoon season in like September, and quarterly budgets open up on July 1st. So how long does it take to organize a laycan? Probably 45 days, 60 days, something like that.
Yeah, probably a few weeks at least.
Yeah. So this is when India typically comes in to buy. Well, interestingly, China had, I think it was here in August, China had a couple of accidents at mines in Shaanxi province, which produces a little bit of their coking coal, and as a result, they've increased inspections, they've increased safety inspections, so they're producing at a lower rate. So now you have a situation where China and India are both out in the market buying, and here we went from 250 up to 300, in just the span of a month. I mean, it just happens like that. As soon as you move outside of what the cost curve can do, you just have to pay whatever you can get. I think we sort of progress seasonally in the same way. So, August, we probably peak in sometime this month or in October. The price to look at for met coal is probably up here at 3. I think people are going to look at this level and say, I want to try to get the last ton in under that if I can. So it's probably a lower high. And then during October or November, we're going to come down, I would think, maybe December, and start to test these levels back down in here around 230, 250. That's kind of where I see longer term prices kind of settling out. Because if you looked at the cost curve right now on mine like Illawarra at South 32, I think their cost is about $200, $205 or so for a decent quality met coal. Add on at least 10% profit, and your long-term price is kind of $225.
Yeah.
So I think
that's benchmark is this?
What's that?
Which benchmark is this?
This is PLV Australia, like the benchmark metallurgical coal.
PLV Australia. Okay.
Yeah. So this is traded on the Singapore exchange. Gotcha. These futures. Kalang likes to make fun of me because I don't put physical assessments. I'm not allowed to distribute them. I get them, but I can't show them. Whereas futures I can. So I use these. It's not a 1-for-1 with what happens in the physical market, but it's a good proxy for direction. more so than anything else. And if I'm going to do a price forecast, I need to know directionality and rate of change more so than anything else.
Yeah.
But this is Australia. If we wanted to do the U.S. prices are going to be based off of PLV prices.
Okay.
So I think the net back to the U.S. relative to Australia is probably about $35 a ton or thereabouts. So if we're at if we're call it 300, then U.S. low vol, which is what would be the comp here, would be about 265 per ton or thereabouts. And high vol A, the good quality high vols would be right around that level, maybe 5% lower, 10% lower normally, or if supply is really tight, equal to. And then the weaker high vols would be 10% below wherever high vol A is. But honestly, you could just use this to kind of set your watch by. The U.S. is pretty illiquidly traded. They do a lot of quarterly contracts. A lot of it gets off the books. There's not a lot of spot activity that comes in. So Australian PLV is a better market to just sort of analyze from a pricing perspective.
Okay. And then what about on the thermal side?
On the thermal side, you have, there are two markets in met coal too, Atlantic and Pacific Basin.
Yeah.
But it really on the thermal side, it gets exaggerated. This is Newcastle. Newcastle is basically the global benchmark for high calorific value thermal coal. Again, you can see how difficult it was. 40 million tons of 40 million tons of coal supplied by Russia into Europe, and they don't have a backup. That's what drove this. They just had to scramble to fill up inventory so that they knew they could make it through the winter, and they'd pay any price. And that any price was, $450. And you can see, this was the previous high of all time, $120. So this is how really, really unprecedented, that 2022 was.
This explains why a lot of European energy prices were 4 or 5 times their typical bills and whatnot. Wow.
Right. So, the price points that I've been looking at, it's really here. I think this July high of $120 is a really good sort of general level to look at for. That's about as low as it can go. If we move much below that, there are a few mines that we're going to be below production cost on that would start to impact the market negatively.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of it for the functional floor. I had this one kind of penciled in from the July curve low, but I'm not sure we're going to get back down there unless gas becomes free anytime soon. And even now, with both China and India in the market buying, we're well above the where we started to bottom out here, back in the springtime, back in March. So I think somewhere between 120 and call it 200 for Newcastle is a pretty reasonable range to assume until gas markets really, really get oversupplied for multiple years in a row.
Interesting. So this is kind of a new normal on the coal pricing front.
Yeah. And all of these thermal coal indices are traded on the Intercontinental Exchange on the ICE. So, you can go to the ICE's webpage and actually look up daily prices there. Singapore gets a little bit more involved. But Bar Chart also has, they post them every day. You can see the whole curve for, if you want to. But just give you an idea about how.
Prices are insane.
Yeah. Well, here's, this is the Japan LNG price. So you can see how correlated this is. So whatever gas does, that's what thermal coal is going to do. And then you have to understand where the cost curve sits and where you need to put your boundaries. But I am the worst weather analyst and gas analyst on the planet. I consume information from other people who are way smarter than me on the matter. Obviously, we have some potential tightness coming up in the U.S. market when the LNG export facilities switch on. But that has the opposite effect for global markets. So it's a complicated universe of stuff. And like I said, I'm a consumer of information when we come here. I'll show you the ARA curve only because the prices are different.
Okay.
So pre-COVID all-time highs were basically $100, and that's right about where we settled out. The prior long-term 2021 curve lows were at about $87, and that's where it came in, like almost to the T. Was this low back here in January 22, right before the big run-up. And then down here is like the prior long-term price that we'd use in evaluation was like $75. We're well above that now. 87 to 90, like this level, is about break-even cost for Consol in the U.S., who's a huge supplier in the Atlantic Basin. Really, they're, if not the lowest cost supplier to the market, they're definitely close. But it costs them about, I think they make a $5 margin or so at $90. So
Okay.
below that level, they drop out, and if they drop out, that's curtains for available supply in the Atlantic Basin. So I think basically $90 is as low as this is going to go. From now until whenever, really. And likewise, here's ARA European thermal coal import prices versus TTF. So again, as goes the TTF price, so goes thermal coal. In addition, obviously they have restocking seasons for each one. For thermal coal, they restock they start to buy in the summer, in the winter, when they begin to deplete their stockpiles, and then take delivery during the shoulder season when they build up. For met coal, the seasonality is a little bit different. India buys, like I said, in the summertime. China buys in the summertime too, usually a little bit after. They both stop buying in like October, November, December range. It gets a little murky. And then China really rocks the market right before like the Lunar New Year celebration. So usually like January, February, even into early March, China will pump the market higher and get in as much inventory as they need then.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So
with prices blowing out like this, I mean, obviously the equities have done really, really well. I wanted to spend a quick moment kind of touching base on both the thermal and the met kind of stocks. Obviously the thermal side, you mentioned Consol, but also Alliance and Peabody, Hallador. How do you see these guys now, considering, they've had quite a run, but, prices have come back down and seem to be firming up a little bit here?
I mean, the big difference now is, they don't have any debt, or, at least not much. So, given that they're making the margins that they are, there's no longer, risk of default or bankruptcy or anything like that. But this is Consol here. This is Hallador, which has actually done really well here over the last, it's doubled almost doubled since March. This is our friend Peabody.
Yeah, I saw in an interview you did last fall, you're talking about the shareholder return policy there. Obviously, they came out in April and announced the big kind of repurchase program. The stock's only up about, 13%.
That's right. People were so excited about the shareholder return program. It went from 26 all the way down to 18.
Usually the opposite is expected.
Well, I mean, that sort of gives us a chance to talk about, dividends versus buybacks. And there's one company on here that has a really screaming hot buyback on, and that's Consol, and it's by far the best performing. I mean, this is meme stock territory. Look at that.
Yeah, wow.
So Hallador, I don't know. I haven't looked at, but I assume that they're doing something similar. BTU didn't decide to do, didn't decide to really crank up the buyback until somewhere around in here. Is when they sort of made that announcement. I mean, the moral of this story, I think here is, and of course, Alliance is down here. Alliance is a master limited partnership, so they're very dividend focused. So Alliance is going to perform more with, natural gas prices, coal prices, and then have a, kind of a stickier audience just because they pay a really good dividend. But it's,
What
in
kind of
terms
moves are you kind of most excited about? BTU, just given it hasn't really moved recently, or
well, Consol is dedicating 70% of their free cash flow to share buybacks, and
yeah,
look at that.
that's what we like to hear. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. BTU, they negotiated their the situation with their shorties reasonably well, but the problem is they still have a lot of capital that's locked up that they can't dedicate to buybacks. So it has to come from free cash flow, and they have a lot of kind of lower quality thermal coal that gets lower prices, and they have a lot of U.S. thermal coal that is going to be subject to lower prices as we head into 2024. So they're operating at a little bit of a disadvantage. They do have a MET project that they're going to bring on, over the course of the next 3 years, that's going to help them and add to the bottom line. But really, they've just, they haven't communicated what it is that they plan to do for shareholders, as well as a company like Consol has. Like Consol and Alpha, which we'll talk about in a second, have realized that if you communicate very clearly everything that we make, we're not building a whole lot of new production. We're just going to dedicate it to the buyback. That's what the institutional folks who are invested in coal want to see. And by now we've almost
now.
Yeah, by now we've almost bought back to the point where the incremental seller, either on the retail or at the institutional side, I don't want to say they're gone. They're always there. We're always going to rotate out. The XME ETF, the top 4 stocks are coal stocks. So, and there 2 of them are over 6%. So we know that's going to rebalance here as we move to the end of the quarter. But still, it's just so crystal clear, buybacks over dividends, at least in this situation, until the float gets to a point where it's low enough that they have, the sticky shareholder audience that they want and can move to special divs in the future. So, yeah, so Consol is well on their way. I think BTU is going to get there. I think they're eventually going to get the message, and I guess this is what we should do. They've already been buying. I think they bought back 6-8% of the float, that last quarter already. So they're working on it. But they have more shares. It's going to take them a little bit longer time. They're also developing the North Goonyella met coal mine, which improves their future margins. Like they're doing most of the right things, but they need to sort of communicate that they're really dedicated to returning shareholder value with the buyback as much as they can while they have all these other things going on.
Yeah, because it seems like they've really kind of disconnected with Consol here.
For sure.
Year, basically.
For sure. But I mean, also you can see everybody bottomed here at the same time. That's just price beta. That part's just price beta. Since then, and now BTU's up in these $24 range. Things are going to improve for them. They really are. Most of the risk, for them at this point in time is well behind them. Unless they, make a terrible decision, to do something they can't afford. But there's only so many options available. So
gotcha. And then what about on the Met side?
Yeah, on the Met side, well, I guess while we're talking about thermal coal,
the Australians maybe
should address the Australians. Whitehaven had a screaming buyback, and that was really rewarded. And then we've put it on pause as they've evaluated whether they want to buy 2 BHP met coal mines, which aren't the greatest quality in the world, but Whitehaven has a project called Vickery that's on the Met side. Donnie and Blackwater would diversify them away from a pure thermal coal player into kind of a half and half thermal met, or 3/4 1/4. I can't remember what the makeup is. And that for them, I think just basically helps ensure that they're going to be able to generate free cash flow no matter what market conditions are. I think off into the future, the more diversified you are, the more stable, less volatile that is, especially if you're on the Met side. Yan coal, which is at the bottom here, if I put up lower calorific value Australian coals. It's basically just a mirror image, but their costs are fine. Their dividend program is really, really good. They pay an extremely high dividend, and reinvesting that's going to, you'll be able to compound things that way. New Hope, I think, is the best performer here over the past month or so. But for my money, if I'm buying one, I'm buying Whitehaven. Once they get Donny and Blackwater, which I think they're going to wind up winning the bids for those. When those start to be accretive to the bottom line, then they just get more juice for the buyback when that finally when that becomes accretive. So for me here, I'm still on Team Whitehaven.
Yeah, but these things look like meme stocks a little bit. People made a lot of money from 2020.
Yeah, and I mean we're heading in. I mean, God forbid we have a normal winter too. So I don't think anybody's really talked about that possibility. And but the problem that sits at the root of that hasn't been solved. Without Russia, Europe is still short of BTUs. So they've done a great job of filling the coffers with as much as they can. But any kind of disruption, whether that's from a weather perspective or from a supply perspective or from a demand perspective for that matter, is just there's trouble that could evolve. We'll just say.
Yep.
On the Met side, again, here's Alpha Natural Resources, which has the most aggressive buyback on, and it's gone absolutely vertical in the last 2 months.
Wow.
If I put these on normalize, here's Alpha relative to 2021, and here's everybody else.
Yeah, it's up like over 5,000% or something last 3 years.
It's pretty ridiculous, but Alpha is one of the companies that really sort of gets it. Like they've gone down the buyback route, and they've really committed to understanding who their audience is too. I mean, the audience for coal investors going forward is kind of a mix of high net worth individuals and family offices and retail and a handful of funds that can that don't necessarily have ESG concerns, or in the case of thermal versus met, understand the difference between the two markets. Steel certainly does have ESG concerns, but nowhere near as much as power generation. Power generation, it's a lot of emissions. I think steel globally is something like 8% or thereabouts. So it's a different situation altogether. I mean, you need steel to build windmills. So but the other company we should probably talk about is Warrior Met Coal. So Warrior has chosen to develop a project called Blue Creek, which will be like a A-grade high volatile coal, or a kind of high mid volatile met coal. It'll get a little bit lower than PLV pricing, but Warrior produces the coal in the U.S. that is most like Australian coals, and here pretty soon we're going to get a lot more of it. And they've done pretty well. They're starting to buy back stock a little bit more. They had an announcement where they offered a tender for their debt that frees up some cash to initiate buybacks for themselves. So I think they're going to see a little bit of that appreciation too. It's just it's hard not to look at Alpha Alpha's at about $250. I think in my mind it's worth at least $450. I mean, they're only getting credit for 2 years of coal production, and they have 20 some years of reserves. So it's just it's hard not to look at that strategy and think that they're going to get to some kind of massive special dividend program before everybody else does, and there just aren't going to be any sellers left. Which is,
do you think AMR will kind of rotate from the buyback to the dividend?
Yeah, well, I mean, at some point in time, the stocks go low floats, and buying them requires an appointment. Like the shares that I have.
Is it that tight?
I mean, I'm never selling what I have. Never.
Yeah.
So it's going to stay with me. Like I've already taken profits, and like I need to, like these here just stay. They just stay. We'll add.
Are you tracking HCC at all?
What's that?
Are you tracking HCC at all?
Yeah. yeah, it's again, it's here. I own it as well. The project development for, like, if I showed you the cash flow generation for HCC, when Blue Creek actually comes on, they really accelerate revenue. They really accelerate free cash flow generation. So they're going to have like another wave of growth that will drive valuation up here in the future. Like I think it's probably worth, at least two times where it is here at the moment.
Yeah, we had an inquiry from the Marhome community on that one. So that's good
Warrior. I mean, if you had to buy, somebody asked me, this was about 10 years ago, if you had to buy one coal mine in the United States, which one would it be? And I was like, well, it'd probably be Warrior number 7, because met coal just has a longer shelf life on it, from a pricing perspective than thermal coal does, and that mine is so well branded that in every market around the world, everybody knows it. Everybody knows how to use it because it's essentially interchangeable with Australian coals. Yeah. So, and of course, being an Atlantic Basin supplier, you have flexibility. You can go through the canal and go to China. You can go up to Europe. You can go to Brazil. You can sell into India. You can sell wherever.
Yeah, a classmate of mine's a harbor pilot in the Chesapeake Bay, and he's always loading coal in Baltimore and headed. Those ships usually going to Rotterdam or whatnot. So it's
yeah. So what HBC provides, in a concentrated number of mines, they'll have 3, by the end of by the time Blue Creek comes on. Alpha has recreated that, using a lot of smaller mines and optimizing the network that they have, which is really Alpha looks very different from when I first started talking to them and working with them 15, 16 years ago or whatever. And
even though the stocks have run, it seems like we're still in a pretty healthy position where the companies have just been able to kind of further fortress themselves, get their balance sheets right size. Obviously, they had the huge price movement in 2022. That's come off, but prices are still quite healthy. And now the companies are just going to be in kind of a cash generation position. Is that kind of the way to approach the market right now? It sounds like you're pretty bullish. Is there anything you're tracking on the gloomy side at all, or what should investors keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. That's a fair question. So, risks. Russia is really the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
If the geopolitical will to redistribute Russia's production comes to fruition, then we have another period where things get weird, and they'll get weird in a bad way because the production isn't being sucked up by the 2 highest growing economies on the planet. It's getting pushed over into more mature markets, which ultimately set the longer term price. So that's probably the biggest risk. On the steel side, if we think about PCI, so the pulverized coal injection, right? PCI replaces coke. Europe has been using a lot of it for years. It's mostly been Russia, but you can also inject hydrogen, and they were, I believe, ThyssenKrupp was doing that at the Duisburg plant, and had a program on a long time ago. I believe it started, but the drive to reduce emissions is obviously enormous in the developed world, and there's a chance that plants in Europe would eschew PCI consumption, for instance, by switching over to hydrogen, or alternately switching over to some combination of direct reduced iron fired by hydrogen, and then use an EAF to actually cast the steel. I think ultimately that's going to be a slow development process, but at least on the injection side, I think you could see hydrogen probably make some inroads pretty quickly. Wasn't something I paid much attention to until honestly about a month ago, when I had discussions with with some friends of mine in the industry, and started looking into it a little bit more since. And there's that political will does exist here in the U.S. I mean, we've been moving from blast furnaces to our industry is one of the most mature in the world, so we've been moving toward recycling for a longer period of time. That's going to continue. There's going to be less coke made, in the U.S., but in terms of like overall supply demand, it's only about a quarter of overall production. So if 3/4 of the demand or whatever is coming from the seaborne market, there's time for producers to adjust to a U.S. production slate that is that continues to decline. So I have
fascinating.
To give you an idea, I have one slide that probably displays that better than any other, and that's just the rise of India, right? India is the green bar here. So coming from 2019, 2020.
Oh wow,
yeah, but they were half of what Japan, Korea, Taiwan was taking. This number is going flat to down. Meanwhile, India is going up by 30% or 40%.
Yeah, at least. Yeah, wow. Yeah, 54 to 81. That's a through 2027. Yeah, I mean, India's growing like crazy, and we're seeing on the oil side, they're looking at building one of the largest oil refineries. It's a huge home for hydrocarbons and
and then also, and like I said before, like if India's driving demand, they drive prices too, right? So here's where quarterly budgets opened up, and here's September contract demand for September contracts 10x's over that time.
Wow.
We just moved up and to the right at a 45-degree angle. China came here where we were kind of slowing down. This is when China had their problems at Shaanxi, and now they're in the market too. So like the combination of those two things, I think makes me pretty confident, at least from a pricing perspective, and relative to the U.S. too. I mean, Queensland and Australia passed this royalty law last year that increased the top level royalty up to like 40%. So the costs that completely changed the global cost curve, and at those higher prices, the U.S. is actually the lowest point on the cost curve. So they're the ones that are going to make the highest margins when prices go up. So it's and we didn't talk about BHP or Teck or Glencore or South 32.
Yeah, the big boys.
Yeah, the big diversified companies, but the Teck in particular, I mean, coking coal is a huge percentage of their revenue, but mostly kind of Teck trades along with copper. So it's it's almost less of a vehicle to use, except around earnings when everybody goes, oh shoot, I forgot they produced.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah,
it sounds like maybe we haven't missed the market completely, and there's some opportunities to look at.
I mean,
for the last few years.
Yeah, well, I mean, just from a market perspective, like the multiple is like 2 or 3. The market's only giving them credit for 2 or 3 years of production, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about met or thermal. You're going to get more than that, and the prices are going to be relatively attractive, with regard to their operating costs. So the margins are going to be solid.
There's a lot of investment dollars coming in behind you. So
there's nothing else for these guys to do but to give the money back. So
that's what we like to hear. Well, Matt, I appreciate you taking some time to go through all this. I mean, I guess the title King of Coal is earned for a reason. That's a lot of good information there. Maybe next time we'll have you play some music for us too. That's a fascinating story. But really appreciate you taking time to go through all this, and look forward to kind of tracking into the fourth quarter.
Sounds good, Charles. Well, thanks for having me, and love the Marhelm community. You guys are fantastic, and I've learned so much, honestly, about shipping just from using the service and being on the Discord than even I could have bargained for. So you guys are absolute delight. Love everything about the company.
Great, awesome, appreciate it.
All right, take care, guys.
Talk to you soon.